PATV presents Live from Prairie Lights, featuring the best authors and poets on the scene today. From up-and-coming to well-established writers from across the globe. You'll see them right here on PATV.
Thanks, guys, for coming. We're going to get started here. First, as always, we really need to thank everyone at Jan and Prairie Lights for hosting this event. We need to thank this evening's panelists, you guys, the audience, and then really everyone generally for participating in a conversation that right now is taking place this week across kitchens and dining rooms, houses of worship, coffee shops and diners, dorm halls and boardrooms, and across every media format possible. When they were cooking this event up, Granta sent the following bit along, and I'll just read this to you from the email. We have a series of events coming up for the launch of our next issue, Granta 116, 10 years later, in which we'd like to humbly start a conversation that roams America. These events are an elaboration on the print issue, which takes a broad look at stories across the globe by writers from the likes of Pico Iyer, Neruda Farah, Janine De Giovanni, and Ben Jaloon, and writers who are war veterans and former Guantanamo detainees. From domestic life in the U.S. to a street vendor in Tunisia, we're not trying to find answers, but rather explore how an event of this magnitude reverberates. From the East Coast to the West, we'd like to stimulate conversation about how the world has changed, aesthetically, morally, and politically, since the 9/11 attacks. There are well over 30 events of this kind in planning for this issue in independent bookstores across the U.S. These cities include New York City, Ann Arbor, Boston, Boulder, Chicago, Houston, Madison, Minneapolis, Oakland, Philly, Portland, Raleigh, Richmond, San Francisco, Santa Fe, Seattle, St. Louis, Tempe, D.C., and that's not to mention Iowa City, London, Berlin, and Toronto. Tonight's event is streaming live on the web courtesy of the Virtual Writing University, and the audio will be available later for podcasting, video from public television, and the commissioned pieces by this evening's panelists will be featured on Granta's website in the coming days. For now, I will introduce you to tonight's moderator, IWP Director Christopher Merrill. He's published 4 collections of poetry, including Brilliant Water and Watch Fire, for which he received the Peter I.B. Lavin Younger Poets Award from the Academy of American Poets. He also has many edited volumes and books of translation and 5 books of nonfiction, the latest of which, The Tree of Doves, Ceremony, Expedition, War, will appear in 2 weeks. His work has been translated into 25 languages, and his honors include a knighthood in arts and letters from the French government. He directs the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, and what his bio does not say, he's the engineer of Iowa City's UNESCO City of Literature designation, a voice at the forefront of cultural diplomacy, and he has 2 of the most brilliantly talented daughters you'll ever meet. I'll give you Christopher Merrill.
Thank you, Joe. You got the right detail last. That was the good one. And I'm also very grateful to Joe and to John Friedman at Granta and his staff for putting this together and for staying on top of it as thoroughly as he has. In the first days and months after 9/11, when Americans were still reeling from the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, it was common to hear that everything had changed. And some things certainly did change. We started not 1 but 2 wars, which have cost an unimaginable amount in terms of blood and treasure. We established a regime of interrogation in prisons in Guantanamo Bay and at Bagram Air Base that shocked the conscience of the world. We produced the infamous torture memos. We created that wonderful new word, extraordinary rendition. We tortured people. We began at home a warrantless surveillance program. In short, we created a general feeling of a great power undone by its fear. We got used to new security measures at the airports. We got used to a steady encroachment on our civil liberties. And we got used to the sense, at least in this country, that around the world, people wondered just what it was that the United States was up to. Lately, it has become fashionable to suggest that indeed nothing changed after 9/11, that in fact Osama bin Laden's attacks only reinforced certain impulses alive in our society. Somewhere between these two poles of thought lies the various truth, the truths that writers seek to articulate in poetry and prose, in the news that stays news. And in tonight's panel, we intend to explore some of those truths, first by reading selections from this really terrific copy of Granta that's for sale here after the reading. Short selections. The writers are also going to say a word or two about why they chose those selections, and then we'll branch out into a larger conversation, which will include the audience later in the hour. We're going to begin with a writer, a novelist and a fiction writer from Pakistan. Bina Shah is a Karachi-based journalist and fiction writer who has taught writing at the university level. She's the author of 2 short story collections, Animal Medicine and Blessing, as well as 4 novels, Where They Dream in Blue, The 786 Cyber Cafe, Slum Child, and A Season for Martyrs. Her work has been translated into Urdu, Spanish, and Italian. I learned yesterday that she's a best-selling novelist in Italian. She's written extensively for international and Pakistani newspapers, including The Independent, the International Herald Tribune, Dawn, and the Friday Times. And she's here under the sponsorship in the IWP of the U.S. Embassy in Karachi. Please join me in welcoming Bina Shah.
Thank you for that introduction, Chris, and hello to everybody. Are there any Pakistanis in the audience? Anyone? No. Okay, I'm the only Pakistani in Iowa, it looks like. I am going to read you a piece from Ahmed Erachidi's essay. I'll read you his introduction first. Ahmed Erachidi was held in extrajudicial detention in the U.S. Guantanamo Bay detainment camps in Cuba for 5 years until his release in 2007. His memoir, A Handful of Walnuts, will be published by Chatto and Windus in 2012. So this extract is from that memoir. And I will start with a small piece called The Visitors. The Visitors. Visitors would come 3 times a day after every meal. They would come by the dozen, and I would wait eagerly for them. I would sit with them, thoroughly enjoying their company. I spent long hours with them and yet did not get bored. They would come and give us hope that life had not come to a halt. Every time I saw them, I felt comfortable. They walked so quietly that the guards didn't know they were there, otherwise they would be eliminated. I am talking about the wonderful nation of ants. These beautiful creatures would visit me in my steel prison, bringing hope and life. I secretly saved food for them in a corner. If the guards saw them, they would either spray them with pesticide or crush them beneath their military boots. I would get angry and shout at them, "Do not the ants have a right to life? They do not trouble you, so why do you have to kill them?" When the soldiers found out that we fed the ants, they punished us by cutting our rations. That didn't stop me from keeping ants in my cell. I observed them and studied their way of life every day. I would sometimes leave them a peanut whenever available. I split the bean into halves and left each half on the floor with the flat side down. The ants would come and eat the entire bean from the inside, leaving the skin as if it had been left for them. If you saw it, you wouldn't know that the inside had been eaten until you turned it over to find it empty. I found it amusing. Whenever I put food in the corner, one of the ants would come to search. If it found food, it would return to its friends and inform them and show them the way. The ants all varied in their contribution to the work. Some carried small pieces, and others carried pieces bigger than themselves back to their homes. I didn't know that ants drank before, but now I would save them a few drops of sweet tea, which they would drink until they swelled up. When the ants came to visit, life would creep back into my dead cell. I would feel hope instead of despair. Their presence in my company, however, was not free of danger, as the soldiers would come to inspect the cells, so I always feared for them. Before inspections, I would blow towards them, which made them disperse, while I got rid of the food. They soon became accustomed to this puff of air, which became their warning signal, so that each time they felt it, they realized danger was close and ran away. When the soldiers would return me back to my cell after the search, the first thing I would look for were ant bodies. When I didn't find any, I felt relieved, knowing that the ants had safely escaped. That is the first part I wanted to read. And the reason that it jumped out to me is because in the Quran, which is, well, we all know what the Quran is, but in the Quran, there is a chapter called The Ant. So when I saw this, I immediately thought of that. It's called in Arabic, Surah al-Naml, which means the ant. And the way that the Quran works is that oftentimes it will start with a story and then expand that story into a parable from which the reader is instructed about God, belief, the unity of God, and the consequences of disbelief. So the many, many, many stories in the Quran can be taken on a literal level and then into more metaphorical and more metaphysical levels. So what we learn from the surah that I'm talking about, the surah talks about the intriguing aspects of the animal kingdom. And we can understand this by a phrase from the surah, which says, "Praise be to God, he will show you his signs and you will recognize them. Your Lord is never unaware of what you do." So what God tells us about the various species of animals is that each one of them is a kingdom unto themselves. They are all nations like the nations of men. And they speak special languages which people can discover and understand. Now, in Surah Naml, Solomon, the great Solomon, had the gift of being able to understand the languages of the animals, and this was called a signal favor from God. So in that surah, Solomon and his army are walking somewhere, and he can hear an ant say to her other ant fellows, "Oh, we must hide because Solomon will come and the people will come and they will trample upon us." And upon hearing this, Solomon smiled. He smiled that he could hear what this small ant said. And then he said a prayer. He said, "Lord, please inspire me to give thanks for the favors you have bestowed upon me and my parents, and to do good works that will please you, and admit me through your mercy amongst your righteous servants." So I just loved hearing that, which is a supplication that Solomon made specifically. It's also a prayer that Muslims say when they're praying, when they're going around the Kaaba during Hajj, all sorts of things. And finally, it's a lesson about remaining humble, even when you are immensely gifted. It's a warning to stay away from arrogance. And so going back to the piece from Granta, what more humiliating situation could there be than a man taken from his family, taken from his country, locked in prison without trial, without legal representation, without any hope? He's in the most vulnerable position of all. They were stripped naked, they were searched, they were beaten, they were all sorts of things. And yet, in the midst of that situation, this man could care about the smallest creature, an ant. And he gave those ants life, and he gave them freedom, and he looked after them and protected them, even when he had none of those things being done to him. So that is why I loved this piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Bina. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce Horacio Castellanos Moya, who last year was an Ida Beam Fellow in the IWP, and now he's working in our Department of Spanish and Portuguese, our newest hire in the creative writing program. It's really a thrill to have him here in Iowa City. He's the author of 10 novels and 5 books of short stories, which together have made him a leading literary figure in the Spanish-speaking world. He was born in Honduras in 1957, but his family moved to El Salvador when he was quite young. During the Civil War there, which you may remember ran from 1979 to 1992, Moya twice fled the country, the first time to Canada and the second time to Mexico City, where he began writing during these travels, during these flights. His novels are much decorated, and they have been translated into French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Swedish, Hebrew, Serbian, and English. His novels in English include Senselessness, She-Devil in the Mirror, Dance with Snakes, and most recently, Tyrant Memory, most of which have been published by New Directions. Please join me in welcoming Horacio.
Thank you, Chris. Hello. I'm going to read the first 2 pages of this magazine. It's a short story. Its title is Redeployment. It's written by Phil Clay. He was a Marine, and he's becoming a writer. When I read this short story, I was shocked. It's a great short story. It's a great short story, and I think that I am not the right person to read this short story because it's by an American and by an English-speaking writer. But I will try to do my best with these 2 pages. So, redeployment. We shot dogs, not by accident. We did it on purpose, and we call it Operation Scooby. I'm a dog person, so I thought about that a lot. First time was instinct. I hear O'Leary go, Jesus, and there is a skinny brown dog lapping up blood the same way he had lapped up water from the bowl. It wasn't American blood, but still, there's that dog lapping it up. And that's the last straw, I guess. And then it's open season on dogs. At the time, you don't think about it. You are thinking about who is in that house, what's he armed with, how he's gonna kill you, your bodies. You are going block by block, fighting with rifles good to 500 meters, and you are killing people at 5 in a concrete box. The thinking comes later, when they give you the time. See, it's not a straight shot back from war to the Jacksonville Ball. When our deployment was up, they put us on TQ. This logistic base out in the desert let us decompress a bit. I'm not sure what they meant by that, decompress. We took it to mean jerk off a lot in the showers, smoke a lot of cigarettes, and play a lot of cards. And then they took us to the Kuwait and put us on a commercial airliner to go home. So there you are. You've been in a no-shit war zone, and then you are sitting in a plush chair looking up at a little nozzle shooting air conditioning, thinking, what the fuck? You've got a rifle between your knees, and so does everyone else. Some Marines got M9 pistols, but they take away your bayonets because you aren't allowed to have knives on an airplane. Even though you shower, you all look grimy and lean. Everybody's hollow-eyed and their camis are a bit to shed. And you sit there and close your eyes and think. The problem is your thoughts don't come out in any kind of a straight order. You don't think, oh, I did A, then B, then C, then D. You try to think about home. Then you are in the torture house. You see the body parts in the locker and the retarded guy in the cage. He squawked like a chicken. His head was shrunk down to a coconut. It takes you a while to remember Doc saying they shot mercury into his skull. And then it still doesn't make any sense. You see the things you saw the times you nearly died. The broken television and the Haji corpse, ice shawls covered in blood, the lieutenant on the radio. You see the little girl. The photographs Curtis found in a desk. First had a beautiful Iraqi kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, in bare feet and a pretty white dress like its first communion. Next, she's in a red dress, high heels, heavy makeup. Next photo, same dress, but her face is smashed and she's holding a gun to her head. I tried to think of other things, like my wife Cheryl. She's got pale skin and fine dark hairs on her arms. She's ashamed of them, but they are soft, delicate. But thinking of Cheryl made me feel guilty, and I think about Lance Corporal Hernandez, Corporal Smith, and Eichholz. We were like brothers, Eichholz and me. The two of us saved this Marine's life one time. A few weeks later, Eichholz is climbing over a wall. Insurgent pops out a window, shoots him in the back when he's halfway over. So I'm thinking about that. And I'm seeing the retard and the girl and the wall Eichholz died on. But here's the thing. I'm thinking a lot, and I mean a lot, about those fucking dogs. And I'm thinking about my dog, Vicar, about the shelter we got him from, where Cheryl said we had to get an older dog because nobody takes older dogs, how we could never teach him anything, how he'd throw up shit he shouldn't have eaten in the first place, how he'd slink away all guilty, tail down and head low and back legs crouched, how his fur started turning gray 2 years after we got him, and he had so many white hairs on his face it looked like a mustache. So there is was. Vicar and Operation Scooby, all the way home. So that's the story. I mean, it's a long story, but it's a great story.
Thank you, Horacio. Next, we'll go to South Africa. Kevin Bloom has written for many South African and international publications, including The Guardian and Times of the UK, The National of the UAE, and the Global Brief in Canada. In broadcast media, he has worked as a radio essayist during the 2010 World Cup in South Africa and as a presenter and co-writer of investigative documentaries. In 2010, his narrative nonfiction book, Ways of Staying, won the South African Literary Award for Literary Journalism, and he is currently co-writing a book titled Whiteout, The Advance of the Chinese and the Twilight of the European in Africa. He participates in this fall's IWP, courtesy of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Kevin?
Hi. I am going to read an extract from a novel by Adam Johnson called The Orphan Master's Son. This extract in Granta is called Third Mate. I will then explain to you briefly why I've chosen this and come back and read another much shorter extract. Jundo was down in the Junma's aft hold, a steel room big enough for a table, chair, typewriter, and a stack of receivers that had been pilfered from American tanks and planes in the war. The hold was lit only by the green glow of the listening equipment, which was reflected in the sheen of fish water that seeped under the bulkheads and constantly slicked the floor. When Jundo looked at the walls, he could visualize what was on the other side. Chambers of tightly packed fish sucking their last breath in the refrigerated dark. They'd been in the international waters for 3 days now. Their North Korean flag lowered so as not to invite trouble. First they chased deep-running mackerel and then schools of jittery bonito that surfaced in brief patches of sun. Now they were after sharks. All night the Junma had long-lined for them at the edge of the trench. At daybreak, Jundo could hear above him the grinding of the winch and the slapping of sharks as they cleared the water and struck the hull. From sunset to sunrise, Jundo monitored the usual transmissions. Fishing captains mostly, the ferry from Uichi to Chongjin, even the nightly check-in of 2 American women rowing around the world. One paddled all night, the other all day, ruining the crew's theory that they'd made their way to the East Sea for the purpose of having sex. Hidden inside the Junma's rigging and booms was a strong array antenna, and above the helm, disguised as a loudspeaker, was a directional antenna that could turn 360 degrees. The US and Japan and South Korea all encrypted their military transmissions, which sounded only like piercing squeals and bleats. But how much squeal and where and when seemed important to Pyongyang? As long as he documented that, he could listen to whatever else he liked. Jundo couldn't abide program broadcasts. Why was the world so obsessed by politics, news and religion? A speech is made, something crashed, God is still angry. The news couldn't tell you anything about people. He loved shortwave operators, strangers who spoke into transmitters like the sky was a diary. The lepers broadcast, as did the blind and the families of inmates imprisoned in Manila. All day the families would line up to speak of report cards, baby teeth and new job prospects. There was Dr. Rendezvous, a Brit who broadcast his erotic dreams every day, along with the coordinates of where his sailing boat would be anchored tomorrow. There was a station in Okinawa that broadcast portraits of half-Japanese families that US servicemen had refused to claim. Once a day, the Chinese broadcast prisoner confessions, and it didn't matter that the confessions were forced, false, and in a language he didn't understand. Jun Do could barely make it through them. And then there was the girl who rode in the dark. Each night she paused to relay her coordinates, how her body was performing, and the atmospheric conditions. Often she noted things. The outlines of birds migrating at night. A whale shark signing for the cruller for bow. She had, as she said, a growing ability to dream while she rode. So I come at this story and this topic via a very indirect route. As Chris had mentioned, I'm traveling across Africa writing a book about how the Chinese are changing the continent. And it struck me that in the last 10 years, China's interest in Africa has increased 1,000-fold. And these have been the 10 years since 9/11. And while the United States has spent trillions of dollars in funding wars that have led to the credit default crisis that happened a couple of weeks ago, China's economy has been growing at unprecedented rates, and its economy has mostly been growing via the fuel, via the resources that the African continent provides it. So the West has been looking to the Middle East, China's been looking to Africa. China's been looking, of course, to the whole world, but specifically it's been looking to Africa, because Africa's resources remain unexploited, and I use that word advisedly. In the last scramble for Africa, which took place between 1880 and 1908, the European powers maybe got 5% of the resources. In the next 20 years, those resources are going to be under serious threat. The second scramble for Africa is for keeps. Which is not to say that China's interest in Africa is always nefarious. China has been building roads across the continent. For the first time, I will be able to drive from Johannesburg to Luanda in Angola. For the first time, people in Nairobi will be able to drive to Addis Ababa. The continent is being linked and economies are being fired up. Ethiopia has one of the highest growth rates in the world, if not the highest growth rate in the world today, which is directly attributable to China's interest in the country. I'm following a story in Malawi, which involves the Chinese Development Bank through something called CAD Fund, funding a single Chinese entrepreneur who buys cotton from 50,000 Malawian smallholders. That's an economy on its own. Now, why I come to the story is because just like Africa is not a country, Africa is a continent filled with different countries. China is not a homogeneous place either. You have 4 different categories that you can sort of investigate this topic on. And unfortunately, I won't go into those, but unfortunately one of them is the Chinese triads. And I was in Mozambique in March, following a story about Chinese shark fishing. The appetite for shark fin soup is driven. I mean, the burgeoning Chinese middle class wants shark fin soup. And Mozambique has one of the longest, most unpatrolled coastlines in the world. You got 2,800 kilometers of coastline with one Maritimo, one sort of Coast Guard official for every 250 kilometers. And this is a guy who doesn't have a boat or even a quad bike to go up and down the beach. So all this guy does is wait for the fishermen to come on shore, pretends to sort of upbraid them, and they just give him a part of his catch and he goes away. So what happens off the Mozambican coast is that long-line trawlers, just like the ones that have been described here, anchor over the horizon during the day, and at night they come right in to the coast with their lights, and they've got their big arms out there, and they've got these big cables with hooks every 10 meters, and the one's going out, the one line's going out, and the other line's coming in, and all the game fish in the sea are coming onto this trawler. They're the Auschwitzes of the sea. The shark population off the Mozambique coast is probably 90% lower than what it was in the 60s. And this is illegal fishing, and it's to fuel the burgeoning Chinese market for shark fin soup. So the second passage I'm going to read to you describes a falling shark. The captain lit a cigarette, offered one to Jun Do, then returned to tallying sharks using a hand counter to click off each one the machinist winched aboard. The sharks had been hanging from lead lines in open water so that they were in a low oxygen stupor when they breached the water and slammed against the hull before being boomed up. On deck they moved slowly, nosing around like blind puppies, their mouths opening and closing like there was something they were trying to say. The job of the second mate, because he was young and new to the ship, was to retrieve the hooks, while the first mate, in 7 quick cuts, dorsal to Ainan, took the fins and rolled the shark back into the water, where, unable to maneuver, it could race nowhere but down, disappearing into the blackness, leaving only a thin contrail of blood behind. Jean Do leaned over the side and watched one descend, following it down with his parabolic. The water crossing the shark's gills would revive its mind and perceptions. They were above the trench now, almost 4 kilometers deep, perhaps a half hour of free fall, and through his headphones the background hiss of the abyss sounded more like the creeping, spooky crackle of pressure death.
Thank you, Kevin. Our final reader tonight comes here from the workshop. Zizi Packard was born in Chicago, raised in Atlanta and Louisville. Her stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, Story, Plowshares, Zoetrope, All Story, and Best American Short Stories of 2000 and 2003, also on NPR's Selected Short Series. Her nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Essence, O Magazine, and the New York Times Book Review. And she's been honored with many awards, including the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, a Whiting Award, a Princeton Hodder Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Her book, Drinking Coffee Elsewhere, won the Commonwealth First Fiction Award and an Alex Award. It became a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award and was selected for the Today Show Book Club by John Updike. She's currently at work on a novel about the Buffalo Soldiers titled The Thousands, an excerpt of which appeared in the New Yorker's 20 under 40 fiction issue under the title Dayward. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and we're lucky that she'll be teaching in the workshop both in the fall and in the spring of this year. Zizi?
Thank you. I know time is short. I want to just thank all of you guys for coming out here and supporting this great and really important issue of Granta. I'll read 2 sections, but I'll keep my comments at the end brief. But they're from 2 different authors, and one is Fouclé, and already you've heard an excerpt from, but I'm just going to read a small continuation of that. And then the other one is from Tahar Ben Jelouine, who is a Moroccan novelist and playwright and essayist. And the reason I chose these, and I'll maybe just get a little bit to both of them later, but I'll promise to be brief, is that I'm very much concerned with voice and what voice means, and I don't think of it solely as a sort of craft element the way we've all sort of been quote-unquote taught in the Writers' Workshop, but actually as coming from content and having to do with honesty and trying to do truth-telling and to set right and to re-truth and to reclaim various truths. And so that's why you'll find lots of voice-driven sort of confessionals and that sort of thing. And so both of these pieces to me spoke in terms of being very highly voiced and richly textured, and but from continents away. The first one, Redeployment, I'll just read a little bit of, and that's by Fouclé. And just to give you a little background, he was a veteran of the Marine Corps, and you'll see that pretty obviously in this excerpt. Cheryl said, "How are you?" which meant, "How was it? Are you crazy now?" I said, "Good, I'm fine." And then it was quiet again, and we turned down Holcomb. I was glad I was driving. It gave me something to focus on. Go down this street, turn the wheel, go down another. One step at a time. You can get through anything one step at a time. She said, "I'm so happy you're home." Then she said, "I love you so much." Then she said, "I'm proud of you." She said, "I love you too." When we got home, she opened the door for me. I didn't even know where my house keys were. Vicar wasn't at the door to greet me. I stepped in and scanned around, and there he was on the couch. When he saw me, he got up slow. His fur was grayer than before, and there were weird clumps of fat on his legs, these little tumors that labs get, but that Vicar's got a lot of now. He wagged his tail. He stepped down off the couch real careful, like he was hurting. And Cheryl said, "He remembers you." "Why is he so skinny?" I said, and I bent down and scratched him behind the ears. "The vet said we have to keep him on weight control, and he doesn't keep down a lot of food these days." Cheryl was pulling on my arm, pulling me away from Vicar, and I let her. She said, "Isn't it good to be home?" Her voice was shaky, like she wasn't sure of the answer, and I said, yeah, it is," and she kissed me hard. I grabbed her in my arms and lifted her up and carried her to the bedroom. I put a big grin on my face, but it didn't help. She looked a bit scared of me then. I guess all the wives were probably a little bit scared. And that was my homecoming. It was fine, I guess. Getting back feels like your first breath after nearly drowning. Even if it hurts, it's good. I can't complain. Cheryl handled it well. I saw Lance Corporal Curtis's wife back in Jacksonville. She spent all his combat pay before he got back, and she was 5 months pregnant, which, for a Marine coming back from a 7-month deployment, is not pregnant enough. Corporal Reisert's wife wasn't there at all when we got back. He laughed, said she probably got the time wrong, and O'Leary gave him a ride to his house. They get there, it's empty. Weissert looks at this shit and shakes his head, starts laughing. They went out, bought some whiskey, and got fucked up right there in his empty house. Weissert drank himself to sleep, and when he woke up, McManigan was right next to him, sitting on the floor. And McManigan, of all people, was the one who cleaned him up and got him into base on time for the classes they make you take about don't kill yourself, don't beat your wife. And Weissert was like, "I can't beat my wife. I don't even know where the fuck she is." That weekend, they gave us a 96, and I took Weissert's duty for Friday. He was in the middle of a 3-day drunk, and hanging with him was a carnival freak show filled with whiskey and lap dances. Didn't get home until 4 after I dropped him off at Slaughter's barracks room, and I woke Cheryl coming in. She didn't say a word. I figured she'd be mad, and she looked it. But when I got in bed, and she rolled over to me and gave me a little hug, even though I was stinking of booze. Slaughter passed Weissert to Addis passed him to Greeley, and so on. We had somebody with him the whole weekend until we were sure he was good. When I wasn't with Weissert and the rest of the squad, I sat on the couch with Vicar, watching the baseball games Cheryl taped for me. Sometimes Cheryl and I talked about her 7 months, about the wives left behind, about her family, her job, her boss. Sometimes she'd ask little questions. Sometimes I'd answer. And glad as I was to be in the States, and even though I hated the past 7 months, and the only thing that kept me going was the Marines I served with, and the thought of coming back home, I started feeling like I wanted to go back, because fuck all this. The second one, as I said before, is by Tahar Ben Jalwin, and it's an excerpt from A Tale of Two Martyrs, and it struck me for its different tone of voice, but also a sort of different emanation and an expression of anger and frustration. You spend your life swallowing insults, trying to be reasonable, to accept your destiny, telling yourself over and over, that a bright morning will dawn someday, and that life isn't just one long mess of disasters. You don't lose hope. You pray. You look around at the loveliness of trees, a bird in flight, a passing butterfly, a smile on a child's face, and with sudden confidence in humanity, you assure yourself that you're only having a bad spell. It will pass, for God is great and will open some doors. On that particular day, however, Muhammad runs headfirst into a concrete wall. He can't see a single way to escape his fate. He finds no help in the eyes of passers-by, sees no hand held out to him, hears not one word of encouragement, of justice. Muhammad is a universal citizen who runs out of patience. At that point, he could have remembered Ayub, Job, and the Quran, and the patience he must have shown to endure all the afflictions God sent him. But that thought never occurs to Muhammad. Job is far away. Everyone is far away. There's no one left around him. He doesn't even see his mother or his sister Layla, whom he loves deeply. He feels alone, abandoned by God. He looks up at the sky on that cold December morning. Nobody makes the slightest gesture toward him. His solitude is absolute, intensified by the cruel feeling of an injustice he cannot bear. Slapped and then spat on. No one should do that, not even to a dog. His humanity has been erased. Muhammad has no more face, no more pride, no way to look at anyone in the eye anymore. His dignity has been crushed, trampled beneath the dirty shoes of the police. It's insane, he thinks. Because those officers are pathetic. They live off corruption, cringing, running like the governor calls for them to bring him a coffee or come to repaint his villa. They obey, bending over backwards to serve authority. They bow and scrape, toadying to those to whom they owe their jobs. Muhammad Bouazizi resolved to make an end of it, but whatever made him burn himself to death. Such a thing is definitely not part of the tradition and culture of Maghreb, and it is explicitly forbidden by Islam. Anyone who decides to defy God by going willingly to certain death must go on committing this suicide throughout all eternity. He must have seen some pictures of Buddhist monks sacrificing themselves on fire, or perhaps he'd heard about them. This action is so spectacular, it is immediately significant and unambiguous. Fire leaves nothing behind. It takes everything away. Muhammad sacrificed himself in public, in front of the provincial headquarters, before the administration that refused to listen to him. He knew that he had lost his property forever. The police would not give it back to him, and their superiors were not going to take his side to help him. Hang himself at home? That would be useless. Slit his wrist? No good either. Stuff himself with sleeping pills? He couldn't afford to buy any. And besides, that would be a silent suicide, and people would say, the poor soul, he died a good death in his sleep. No, Muhammad wanted to die and to make his death useful in some way to others. Perhaps he wasn't thinking of everyone in the country, but as he poured petrol over himself and struck the match, he must have had time to think of his mother, his brothers and sisters, and maybe his father, who died when Muhammad was only 3. The fire blazed up immediately. Muhammad kept perfectly still. When people ran to save him, it was too late. The flames, too quick for them, had finished their work. Muhammad was still breathing, but he was breathing in a body whose soul was already fragrant with the perfume of paradise, or perhaps the smoky inferno of hell. He was rushed to a hospital in the city of Sfax, and then to the burn and trauma center in Benarus near Tunis. The body was fissuring in a mass of cracks, but the soul, trapped within the ashes, could not manage to free itself, imprisoned within a body that was no longer a body, simply proof of what humiliation can do. Thanks.
We've got a few minutes left, so we're going to try to have a little conversation here. We've had such a range of voices we've heard here, and accents as well. So which is, I think, unusual in the Granta events around the country. We've had a chance to hear from writers from outside this country. And one of the things that the issue raises is the question of how, on the one hand, you write about an event like 9/11, and also how you memorialize such an event. And I thought I'd like to just throw it open to our writers to see if they have some thoughts about it. I might begin with Bina, because I know she's written a piece for Granta, as has Kevin, for their online journal, and perhaps you've got some thoughts about this.
It's very hard for me as a Pakistani to write about 9/11 because, quite simply, it's not my tragedy. It's an American tragedy. And I remember clearly where I was when 9/11 took place. I was at home in Pakistan. It was afternoon time. I was checking my mail and looking at the internet at Yahoo News. So I wasn't even in sync with the rest of this nation, which was just waking up and getting ready for work and going to work and being at work. That's not to say that we didn't see it happen as it happened. I mean, I saw immediately it came up, a plane has hit the World Trade Center tower, number 1 or 2, I can't remember. And so we rushed to the television and we turned it on and we watched with horror as it happened. But I've seen in the last few weeks people saying, if you weren't there, then you have no opinion. So there's a hostility towards anybody, I think, outside of America trying to claim that tragedy as their own. And I don't want to go near that. Although I cannot say that I didn't cry when I saw images and when I looked at pictures and when I hear the tales of the firefighters that went there and lost their lives saving others. So for me, the focus is what happened after 9/11. And that's what the paper that you mentioned focuses on. I've written a paper that I'm going to be presenting at a panel on Friday about the psychological impact of the 10 years since 9/11 on Pakistan's children. For us, that is our tragedy. And everything else that has happened and is happening today and yesterday and will happen tomorrow. I came to this country and it just feels so safe and so secure, but I always remember that we are dying in order to make this country feel that way.
One of the things that Bina was talking about is other voices being sort of tamped down and being sort of shut from being able to speak about 9/11 as though this is something that's only happened to Americans. And I know that the event itself, occurred here on American soil. But part of the problem with that whole ideology in terms of we can claim this and no one else can't, or we're the only voices, meaning Americans are the only voices, I'm talking in the sort of jingoistic we, are the only ones who can talk about it, is I think inherently in error because part of the reason that a lot of this occurred was because you had this sort of foreign policy that ignored other countries and their voices and not to say that all of that they were right or wrong or any of that, but to ignore and to not try to understand and to end diplomacy with the business end of a gun or a bomb is inherently oppositional to what this whole Granta book is about, which is to try to bring in all of the voices so that we can hear and have some sort of conversation.
Yeah, to pick up on that, I mean, from my perspective, there seems to be some sort of irreconcilable paradox going on. On the one hand, when America turned its back on Africa after 9/11, I don't think that was an inherently bad thing for a number of reasons. I don't think the IMF structural adjustment policies ever did much for the continent. I don't think the World Bank ever did much for the continent. I think, and I mean, this could be a controversial statement, I think the NGO community, the development community, harms Africa more than it helps it. So sort of America's focus shifting to the Middle East and allowing China to come in without governance principles, with late capitalism and these pure economic terms, has helped the continent in a lot of ways. On the other hand, I would much rather live in a world with a strong America. And I think the world lost its innocence looking at those images. I certainly lost my innocence. Well, I mean, I lost my innocence a lot before that, but I lost my innocence about America because I think a lot of people want to believe in the land of the free and the home of the brave. We want to believe in these principles. We certainly do in Africa, where our politics are very dodgy. We want to know that a constitution like you guys have got can be protected. And this is not necessarily an empire I want to see fall. I mean, there's a lot that Noam Chomsky says I agree with, but I would rather live in a world with a strong America.
Yeah. But does a strong America mean an America that is armed to the teeth all the time?
No, the opposite. In America, I suppose the best version of America was a version that was articulated by Obama during his campaign. I mean, that would be my dream of a strong America. It hasn't been a version of America that has been able to sort of manifest, but it was articulated.
Well, I think my perspective is a little bit biased. I come from Central America, and so we were not innocent. We didn't have any virginity. We had 3 civil wars in our countries, and more than 300,000 people were killed, and America was supporting most of the killers. So for us, it's all a story. So the new period that is open with in 2001 for us is like kind of far away. We are just recovering what happened there. We were victims too. We commemorate that too. And now here you have to commemorate. I agree with you. I don't like to say how to commemorate, because the victims are the only ones that have the right to decide how to commemorate, right? And so I think that history is almost always the same. Nothing changes a lot. The killing goes on, and it just changes from continent to continent and from power to power. And when I read this magazine, for me, it was like a shock, because I read this story by this soldier. She read better than me. Ex-soldier, ex-marine. And I said, it's the old story. I mean, wars are horrible for humanity. Wars are horrible for society, but not always for literature. If you think about it, sometimes great writers come from, all the experience that they have comes from that war that they participated in. And that's how they got those experiences. Perhaps they didn't write about them. Salinger didn't write about the Second World War, and he was determined by that. That was his big problem, was to be an intelligent officer in there, right? And so it's like that, I guess. So that's what I can say.
I just wanted to add that 9/11 has been great for Pakistani literature, because all of a sudden everybody wants to know, what the fuck are we doing out there? Who are these crazy people? What do they think? Why are they blowing themselves up? You knew that he was there. So everybody's looking to our literature to find out how we think and what we're doing. So again, war is great for literature. It's been good for our literature, but that's not necessarily a good thing for us as a country. In fact, it's been the complete opposite. I think I've never seen my country so broken and so destroyed as it has become in the last 10 years. And when I go home, I do not know what kind of country I'm going to go back to.
Well, and I don't want to at all minimize 9/11, but I think that one of the things that one of the problems that most Americans, and I include myself in that as having this problem, is to always not to magnify, but to regard our hurt as the only hurt. And I think that in a way, I believe that 9/11 obviously should be commemorated, but I think one of the more sort of healing ways, and the way that's sort of a path to greater understanding, would be to understand that this is not the only tragedy that there, as you were saying, in Central America, this has happened. This has happened everywhere. In Africa and in Iraq, you had more people die in 1 3-month period than that. And over the course of several years, hundreds of thousands. And so it's not to diminish what occurred, or the victims or the victims' families, or any of the grieving Americans. But I do hope in a way that when we commemorate, it can be kind of a wake-up call that this does occur over and over again everywhere. That might be my phone.
I think we're running close to the end of the time. If there's time for one question from the audience. No. Ask something. I see somebody back there. Joe?
Is this on?
I think it's pretty easy to admit that we're talking about kind of a lot of negative subjects, like war, economic exploitation, natural resource exploitation, human trafficking, exploitation, all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting to me where you would locate your optimism in this, and the kind of things that you read about and deal with. How do you counter that, or is it difficult to do that with what you're facing in terms of your writing and the kinds of things that you're talking about today?
It's a wonderful question. We'll just go down the line, and that'll be.
Well, I would say I think one of the great aspects of literature is that it can take away, arrest away some of the, or sort of shift the balance of power from those who grab power to those who write about those who grab power, and those who write about those who are powerless. And so I think that without being, propagandistic, one of the more satisfying aspects of literature is that you can actually turn, war around into something that is not just important, but interprets and tries to find some sort of meaning in what occurred, or tries to find some sort of way of showing or expressing human value out of a situation that generally sort of devalues the human. And does that then mean that I think that literature is political? I don't think that it should mean that it is not aesthetically good, or that you should only concentrate on the political. But I think inherently it has within it this context of, well, what nation is one writing from? What kinds of things does one take for granted? And if the writer is aware and has an audience that has somehow been made aware or can be made aware, then that's an incredibly good and positive thing.
Yeah, my answer is not necessarily different from Zizi's. I'm not sure I believe in concepts like negative and positive. In some wide-eyed way, I think I believe in a concept like the truth of a narrative. And the subjects we're dealing with, certainly the subject I'm dealing with is a pretty harsh subject. I think there are a lot of themes in the world that do kind of call for alarmism right now, and getting at them through literature, because even though I write nonfiction, I like to write literature. I like to have at least one sentence on a page that I'm kind of proud of, that. So, like Zizi was saying, getting into character, situating a person in the face of these massive global events, and in my case, I'm not imagining how they would react. I've interviewed them about how they react. So I find my own cause for I'm trying not to use the word optimism. But yeah, I don't have a synonym right now, so I'm finding my own cause for belief, maybe, in the reactions of my subjects, and that's good enough. Also, I mean, also in a turnout to an event like this, in the love for literature.
Please give a big hand to our writers.